r/AskReddit. Pilots flight crews of Reddit. What went wrong on your flight that the passengers never knew about? Mine is from many years ago when I was a student pilot. I was 14 I think at the time. I had about 15 hours done and getting close to soloing for the first time, but still had a few hours and more landings to practice. I was doing some basics and getting ready to come back with my instructor to practice some touch and goes for a bit. Coming back through we had to pass through DTW's Bravo airspace, means need permission to go through it. A few minutes before I was about to call for permission, my instructor got really quiet. I looked over at him and he looked really bad. I thought he was going to puke, so looking for a bag. But then I notice he isn't breathing. I figure out where I'm at and call up DTW approach. Declare a medical emergency and that my instructor was not breathing. I also told them I'm a student and never landed on my own before and never in a large airport. Detroit approach was amazing at helping me. They gave me an option for DTW or Willow, but Willow would have added a good 5 to 10 minutes since I was coming in from the SE. Opted for DTW and they were great at giving me vectors while also getting the big jets out of the way. I remember hearing them tell several planes to go around and several more into a hold. Anyway, did my approach and made the most butter smooth landing I have ever made in my life. Even till this day. Ambulance was right there on the taxi waiting for me. Turns out my instructor, who was only 25, had a heart attack. He ended up being okay. All in all, from first call to him in the ambulance was less than 10 minutes thanks to ATC and DTW Tower. A colleague of mine was flying with a captain who couldn't stop giggling since he got on board his 737. Only when they were cruising that the captain took out a yellow live baby duck from his flight bag. Couldn't believe the story, but the dude recorded a video of a little duck chilling in the sun on top of the mode control panel. As a kid, 8-9, I flew in a small plane with my Air Force dad and his friend. We lived in Minot ND, big base there, and were flying sometime in winter. Later I learned we had such a long joy flight that day because the landing gear froze up. And we were flying around trying to get them to come down. As we were almost out of fuel they were planning to crash land on the frozen river. When in the nick of time the landing gear unfroze and deployed. I had no idea though. It was beautiful flying above a winter wonderland. This thread should know there's a small dead subreddit called Our Tales from Flight Desk that could benefit from these stories. Shit breaks all the time. Normally nothing so bad that the plane is gonna crash. But important enough that we take some sort of corrective action. The systems in planes, I fly a corporate jet, are so redundant and interconnected that you don't always know for sure what's actually broke. Example. You might get a message saying that your ground spoilers failed, but you can look back and see that they're working just fine. Turns out it's just a sensor gone bad. But do you think I flew the plane again until that sensor got fixed? Hell no. So to answer the question, they almost never know. Edit. They don't know until they get the maintenance bill. Edit number 2. My highest rated comment, and it's probably because someone read it while on the toilet. Not a pilot but used to do work on one's house. My favorite story was the time the heater went out in the cockpit but not in the rest of the plane. So the pilot and crew are up there freezing, putting all their clothes on trying to warm up. Instruments and whatnot are freezing up. They had no idea if they were going to be able to land. I was in the process of getting my PPL, private pilot license, and I was flying circuits solo. Before I took off, the CFO of the flight school asked me if I was sure it was a good idea to fly. It's pretty windy. I was flying a Cessna 152 on a day with wind pushing 15 kts and turbulence around 20. I honestly don't know what I or anyone at the flight school was thinking letting me, 16 years old, take off. Anyways, a few bumpy circuits go by with no problem. I actually got some great practice landing in turbulence. So the last circuit of the day, I'm on final with full flaps doing the absolute minimum speed for approach in a 152, not taking into consideration that the air is super turbulent. For those who don't know, when it's bumpy you should be going a little faster on approach than usual. Anyways, I'm quite close to the ground, maybe 300 to 400 feet, and I can hear the wind blowing over the sound of the engine. Suddenly, no wind. I had just lost 15 to 20 knots of almost direct headwind on final approach with absolutely no airspeed to spare. I remember my shirt sleeves looked like they were inflating, and the plane stall warning started screaming at me. The controls became totally useless, like a limp computer joystick. Thankfully I had my hand on the throttle like my instructor taught me, and for whatever instinctual reason, good instructor probably, I gently pushed the throttle all the way and slightly lowered the nose. All of this took place in the span of about 5 seconds. I remember what I did, but not thinking about doing it. It was like when you drive somewhere and you suddenly realize you've arrived without remembering driving. Damn scary. Anyways, I landed the plane just fine and went home and took a nap. My parents said I was pale as a ghost when I got home. Flying is fun until it isn't. I'm not a pilot or flight crew, but I am an aircraft hydraulics specialist in the United States Air Force. Had a jet in-flight emergency for loss of hydraulic quantity. Turns out a clamp had broken on the side of the engine and the pressure line from one of the hydraulic pumps had shaft. Lost all hydraulics and had to use all backup systems, and the jet had to be towed all the way from the runway to the flight line. It was in a WAC, so there is a rather large flight crew in the back that just operates the computer systems. I'm sure some of them didn't know that they were in such a critical situation. Landed on the wrong runway. It was nighttime, and tower didn't inform me of my misjudgment until less than 1/4 mile away. I was a young private pilot and had a few passengers, so it wasn't too big of a deal. While staring up into the rotor system one evening under nods, I suddenly realized there were 2 rotor systems. A Versus 22 was supposed to land in the 3rd spot adjacent to us. Instead they parked next to us with rotor systems running over our rotor system. We emergency engine shut down and ran. While laying in the dirt, both of us crew members asked each other who got the passengers. Neither of us did. We didn't say shit to them when we got back in. I was flying 2 of my friends back from some tasty barbecue in Georgia a few years back. As we got closer to home, the weather really started to get bad. A lot of pop-up storm cells. It was a perfect situation for my iPad, used for navigation charts, to totally die, as well as my onboard weather radar. I was internally panicking, and air traffic control was my saving grace and helped me get home safe. A few months later my friends asked the same question. They said I looked so calm, so they figured it was no big deal. Similar story to you. I'm a relatively new student pilot, and I was just starting to practice pattern work by myself, but my instructor either wanted me to go up with him for a few laps before soloing, or with another instructor if he had other students. So, my instructor has another student he's teaching. I end up going up with another instructor, just to verify that little 10 hours me can still fly a plane. Before I practice for an hour or 2, we take off, and as I'm on final for our last practice run, it's a little shaky as it is usually in the mid-afternoon in Florida, but I'm confident in my ability to land the plane. Well, to my surprise, when I'm about maybe 100 feet above the runway, the plane just drops in an instant, like someone took their hand and just pushed down. Luckily, my instructor must have trained me well, because like you, I had my hand on the throttle and just gently pushed the power to full, leveled the nose, and made a smooth go around. Made me feel good knowing that my brain knew what to do without having to think about it much. Also, the instructor I was with I always thought seemed to look a bit angry, but I was pleasantly surprised when he smiled and complimented me on my quick decision making. Getting a compliment for doing something specifically well, other than like "good job today," boosted me as a new student. It wasn't necessarily a situation where I'm thinking "oh shit, we could have died," but knowing that I'm capable of recovering from a scenario as such, and not ending up like the guy who slammed a plane onto the runway and broke the gear. I still hear about the landing gear incident guy, and it's been months. I'm not a pilot, but flying into Vegas one time, the whole plane rotated counterclockwise about 40 degrees while we were in landing approach. The captain immediately went full throttle, aborted the landing, and came around for another pass. He chuckled, haha, little wind shear there. Folks, sorry about that into the intercom, but I'm pretty damn sure he'd just saved all of our lives. I peeked in the cabin to thank him as we disembarked, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost and lived to tell the tale. I wasn't carrying a passenger. But I think it's a relevant story. I was 19 and had bagged myself a flying scholarship from the RAF. They basically paid for me to go to a civilian flying school for a month and learn how to fly. So, I was out on my first solo cross-country flight, and about 20 miles in, was just about to make my turn that would take me over the Pennines, a long range of hills that form the spine of the UK. And being a diligent pilot was constantly checking my instruments. All of a sudden my oil pressure gauge just dropped to 0. And I quite rightly got a bit worried. I immediately turned around and made my way back to the airport, whilst picking out fields where I could make an emergency landing should my engine suddenly stop. I made it back safely, taxied back to the flying school hangar, and shut down. I immediately reported the fault, to be told, oh yeah, it does that sometimes. I'm sure you can imagine how unimpressed I was. I've had medicals on board where we're dealing with them in the galley, going to get the oxygen, and other passengers will stop me to ask me how long it'll take for their food to be cooked because apparently they've been waiting ages.